Krithika, forgive me, as a former energy reporter, it seems to me that one of the critical factors is that with fracking, the U.S., is now a huge energy producer, which when the Saudis were when we were such a benefactor of them was when after the oil embargo and when we really needed energy. And to me, that seems a real shift in the balance of power. Maybe you could comment on that, and then Chad, you could unmute Ian to ask the last question, and then we'll close it.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, oil and energy has been so central to this whole project to the point where, as I said before, it's sometimes been called petro-Islam. And, you're right. Well, like a lot of the Saudi energy story in the last decade has been one of disappointment. Aramco had a huge IPO, but it was so much less than the $1 trillion IPO that MBS was hoping for. And the US is no longer quite as dependent on Middle Eastern oil as it was in the 70s when the embargo had such a big effect.
Right.
So, I mean, I think they're not, they're of course so aware of this. That's the whole Vision 2030 thing, is to try and diversify the sources of their income. One of the problems they're facing is that Saudi citizens are used to almost like a rentier state where they get so much welfare from the government. They get so much stuff for free historically, in recent history, that it's hard to convince them to either get used to giving up a little bit of that, and also to motivate a lot of them to become really productive human capital and join the workforce. Because a lot of the jobs for several decades were like sinecures. Like if you're a Saudi man, you could get like some kind of job in the government. Maybe it wasn't really meaningful or productively adding so much to the economy, but you were guaranteed a job. If you really want to grow your economy now, that can't be the case. So he's really facing a huge human capital challenge. And I think those are all, and COVID has not helped any of these things. So we'll have to see how it goes. But I think you're right on all the fronts, and the decreasing of our relationship on Saudi oil is one reason why our relationship is at a low now.
So can Ian ask his question? Chad, did you unmute him?
Sure, I'll be quick. Fascinating talk. I was in Kosovo, and the points that you make, and Christopher, Dickey, all throughout the Balkans, these wonderful old Ottoman madrasas from a Sufi tradition were being knocked flat and the guise of repairs, and replaced with Saudi Kellogg's cornflakes box mosques with minarets, square concrete boxes. And it was a sort of deliberate deculturation. I actually tried to speak to several of the charitable teams from Saudi Arabia who were suitably suspicious. And I was surprised because they operated outside the remit of everybody else. But more to the point was, you couldn't get into Saudi Arabia you're describing this from the periphery. But I'd always assumed there was some type of dynamic tension, that is that the regime was almost as much hostage to the Wahhabis as vice versa. The regime depended on them. So even though they knew there were murky things going on in the Washington embassy and that they were up to all sorts of dangerous things, they were happy with them being up to dangerous things abroad than being up to being dangerous things at home. And I'm wondering to what extent, I mean, has MBS really exercised the fear of the Wahhabis? Can he really count on them? Especially in the conditions you're talking about of the post-COVID economy, the post-Aramco economy, can he really rely on keeping the genie in the bottle that he's put in? Because one analogy that occurred to me is the Germans put a lot of money into the Bolsheviks in 1917. But they were never able to put the genie back in the bottle after they'd finished spending it. The seed corn was quite enough to see them through the Comintern and 2 world wars.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I mean, I think the central thing to know about this relationship between the royal family and the Wahhabi clerics is that there's always this push and pull dynamic. For a long time, it's been very symbiotic, and often the authority delegated to the clerics increased when Saudi's religious credentials were under attack. So in 1979, after the siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca, they really gave a long leash to the Wahhabi clerics, and they got to like steer the education ministries. They got to really step up the religious police and just like really police the texture of day-to-day life in Saudi. But MBS is really pushing hard in the other direction, and he wants to show that he's the boss. And he is he has kind of asserted his authority over the clerical establishment to an unprecedented degree. So, not just putting certain clerics in jail, but also kind of unilaterally passing some of these decrees about women being allowed to drive and so on. The one thing that I can't speak to, and I think is definitely worth more reporting on, is how people on the ground feel in Saudi Arabia. I've only been to Saudi cities. I've only been to Riyadh and Jeddah. And a lot of people I talked to there were very excited about the changes happening. But it's a big country, and people are very religious. So I'm curious what the pushback is on the ground to some of these modernization measures. And I don't actually know, and I'm keen to see how it plays out because it's still early in the campaign. A good colleague of mine, Karen House, who is the author of On Saudi Arabia, has said that a lot of people she knows in more rural or suburban Saudi really hate these changes. They hate like tourism coming to Saudi, and they really are quite pious. So it'll be interesting to see if MBS can keep this popular support to the extent that like an autocratic ruler needs support, but he can't completely piss everyone off, right? So I don't think he's being held hostage by the Wahhabis at all, but I think he is getting some pushback for his very, very ambitious program of domestic changes.
Well, that seems like a good note to end on, unless, Chris, you have something else.
No, that's
Okay.
great. Also, it's like, 12:30 in the morning here. So.
Oh, yes.
You
So
guys.
thank you. So thank you very much, Krithika and Chris, for a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot.
Thank you so much for attending, and thanks to OPC again for supporting my fellowship last year. My book is available anywhere you can buy books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. So I hope you do check it out. And have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.